Good morning. This is Ken Long from the Curriculum Development Shop in Delro. And the title of this recital is Army Force Management, A View from 10,000 Feet. I thought it would be useful to share with you my understanding of force management and F-100 prior to getting into the details of each of the individual lessons that constitutes our curriculum. It's very easy in this topic area to get lost in the to get lost among the trees, and so I want to try to give you a top-down view from 10,000 feet. The most important thing to remember is that it's always better to have fun than do force management, so whenever you can avoid an assignment in the force management business. That would be a good thing. It's really, really hard. So you have that to look forward to. A little bit of background. What are all these people talking about when we talk about force management? And why should we study it? Well, it's like war. Even if you're not interested in force management, it's interested in you. And much of what field grade officers do when they're not actively being S3s and XOs is directly related to force management. My background, I've been a FA-50 card-carrying member for 12 years, and I've had one job in the field that lasted for 2 years as the Infantry and Soft Force Analyst for the Force Design Directorate in TRADOC in 1994. The FDD mission is to integrate all of the designs for units that come out of the proponent school. So when the 2 stars have a good idea about what their type units should look like, those designs go to TRADOC FDD in order for integration analysis to be performed, and then if it passes through that gate, it goes up to TRADOC, then out to the field, and ultimately to the vice and the chief for decision. So I did that for 2 years. I've been to the Force Management School twice, in 94 and 2004. In 94, it was to go through the pilot course for FA-50, which had been discontinued for a number of years and then was reinstituted in 94. And I went back again in 2004 to re-blue my skill set as a Delro instructor. While I was in TRADOC FTD, I was a Force Design Update Action Officer. As a captain, I received 12 mature issue packages from 8 different proponents, briefed them around the world, then up the chain of command, ultimately culminating in a decision briefing to the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. And then those designs went ahead and competed in that year's TAA for resourcing. While I was in FDD, I came across the first modularity pamphlet, the TRADOC PAM 525-66. That's 1994 when the term modularity first came into vogue, and sort of have been following the modularity trail of tears since then. I also participated in a division redesign in 94 and 95. The Army took a serious look at how to organize the Army, either as a division base or a brigade based or a battalion based. After a lot of consultation with analysts at TRAC and with the graybeards and the active Army leadership, the resulting decision was to field the limited conversion division design, which essentially turned in the Delta company of each maneuver battalion and redeploy those slots and equipment into other units. Much of the arguments for brigade combat team based Army were seen in that exercise, but the decision at that time was to go for division. I also participated in a couple TAA cycles, Total Army Analysis, and I got to see the resourcing side of the equation. After that assignment, 94 through 96, I held a variety of FA-90 jobs in brigades and divisions until coming here as a Delro instructor. And my observation is that many of the things that I did in the Tactical Army were directly related to things that are occurring in the FA-50 functional area. And so the reason for field grades to go through F-100 and understand Army change management is that much of their pain, much of their work is going to be directly related to that field. So the perspective that I want to give you in the next 30 or 40 minutes or so is from a practitioner and an interested observer of force management, and to try to give you some background so that when you're delivering F-100 as designed, you can see some of the connections to broader Army issues. The reason I think that's important is because it's very easy, given the breadth of our curriculum, to get lost inside of the individual lessons. You may know that this is our core curriculum map, our maneuver graphics, if you will, for the core curriculum. We have two main lines of curriculum. That which deals with the sustaining of the operating force, and that is Charlie 210, 301C, and Charlie 403, the Army sustainment lessons, 304, Foxtrot, and Delta, which are the joint sustainment functions. And then the other main line we have deals with F-100, which is the generating force. And we have 8 lessons and 18 hours, and there's a lot of material inside that. And so the purpose of this briefing is to try to give you some exposure to the broader issues that go throughout force management and help you make some connections and maybe answer some questions and engage in interesting dialogues with the students when their questions come up. So we'll come back and visit this after the speech. A couple years ago, we did a bottoms-up review of F-100 topics and made a decision that we wanted to incorporate future combat system case study into the curriculum. And the reason for that came about from a consideration of what kinds of questions does force management try to ask or try to answer for the Army. And we were trying to get the big ones right. For example, the list of questions we came up with included things like, well, how should we organize for combat? The JSIDS lesson and the JSIDS material really tells us what DoD says we have to do in combat and how we should organize. And what should those organizations look like? The modularity themes and in both the regular sustainment lessons and the F-100 lessons address that, the specific details of what those organizations look like. How should we man and equip them? The Future Combat System case study in F-104 gets after that question. And how should we sustain the combat power and readiness of those units? The R4Gen lesson talks about how we do that, how we rapidly refit and how we rapidly reorganize and prepare a unit for its next operational cycle. So those look like the big questions that force management grapples with all the time. There are other things that get brought up in the lessons and in discussions, like how do we specifically manage change in force structure? And that's where concepts like the .mil-PF domains, the force design updates, the R-struct message, which is the listing of the resourced Army forces throughout the program years that emerges out of TAA, is considered. That tells you what you have to build to. There are other types of programs out there like Aviation Restructuring Initiative, Medical Restructuring Initiative, Engineer Restructuring Initiative, which students may have gone through at various times in their life. Each one of those was an attempt to manage an entire branch's force structure led by the proponent, and it was an end-to-end and bottoms-up, top-down review of an entire Army branch. So all of those are topics inside detailed force structure management. How do we manage change inside specific units? And you'll see references to things like the DA readiness teams that come to help a unit in R4Gen, the 3ID conversion program, the 1st Division to go from a division base to a brigade base, and all the management challenges associated with that is a pretty good case study. R4Gen itself is a detailed plan for managing unit change. Initiatives in USR, Strategic Readiness Initiative, WebTADS, and FMS Web, all of those get inside the nuts and bolts of how we manage unit change. Manning the force. We don't cover as much as we might, but that gets after the personnel side, how you recruit them and train them and educate them, and we're part of that business as well. So those are some of the maybe smaller programs, but which are integral to how we answer those main 4 questions in the middle. How should we organize for combat? What do the organizations look like? How do we equip them? And how do we maintain them? and their combat power. All of those are answered at various places and threaded throughout the F-100 curriculum. So there's a real danger inside our lessons and inside this world of getting down into the trees, and so teachability becomes an important consideration. As an example, in the F-104 lesson, there's a 38-page reading from the Congressional Research Service which summarizes all of the issues associated with future combat system for the benefit of Congress, so they can ask intelligent questions of us. If you were to mind map that lesson, you might find something like this emerging. Issues and variables and organizations and cross-departmental considerations. Very, very detailed. It would be simple to spend 18 hours simply going through that reading and those issues. And so before we get lost in those details, I think it's handy to step back and take a top-down look. So let's consider for a moment what's the problem for the Chief of Staff of the Army to solve? And I know it's not the offensive line, or is it? Let's think about his challenge from a threat perspective. His real challenge under Title 10 is to build a force that addresses a wide range of threats. Here's an array of threats, a mental model that you can use to think about threats. You can't really afford to organize against the most likely threat, because the least likely threat is that of nuclear war, but the consequences of failure of that are so great that we have to treat that as our first strategic priority. And so the chief ends up making force structure allocation decisions, his design of the force, as a function of the cost of failure to handle a threat along these dimensions. So on the bottom axis, you will see intensity of combat, let's say from low to high and extending up into nuke land. On the left-hand side, on the vertical axis, let's consider the nature of the threat, ranging from conventional to special operations forces, with a distinction between heavy and light forces in conventional. And the dotted line represents a notion of the boundary between special operations and conventional operations. We're seeing more and more units asked to cross over. Soft units being asked to conduct direct action, light forces asking to take on some of the missions and skill sets formerly handled exclusively by special operations forces, especially when you think of civil affairs and nation building. It turns out that there are certain efficiencies that you gain and effectivenesses that you gain by organizing specific types of units to manage different parts of this spectrum. And so, for example, here's an array of what you might call the force over the last 5 years, where we have specialization in a mission focus on different aspects of this threat continuum. Infantry brigade combat teams, well suited for operations when the threat is conventional and at the lower intensity of the spectrum. Heavy brigade combat teams that can actually operate in nuclear environments and well suited for high intensity combat when the threat is conventional. Strikers, created to handle those in-between types of missions where you have to be deployable, but you need to have enough protection and firepower to handle a significant conventional threat. So Stryker was really designed to fill that middle gap, to balance deployability and combat power. In special operations land, at the low-intensity side, you might have civil affairs units that are in the nation-building process, other units in special ops that are designed for high-intensity strike missions, perhaps. Psychological operations units that are shaping the battlefield and across the spectrum of intensity. Units like SF groups and Ranger regiments that are capable of performing both conventional and special operations type missions depending on the need. One of the things you'll notice, though, is that in the blue areas there's always some capability gap where to perform missions in those areas, we have to ask a unit to stretch out of his normal range of missions and respond to that particular contingency. It's a fact that you cannot afford to buy enough force to completely cover the entire threat spectrum. We spend more money already than the next 24 nations combined, and we still have capability gaps that enemies can exploit. And the red dots, or the red stars, excuse me, show you areas where an enemy force is taking advantage of a capability gap and causing us problems. And that can go across the spectrum. One of the things that you can say, you can consider and challenge the students with, is the idea that our very success inside the domains in white have driven the enemy into those gaps, because we've killed all the guys that are dumb enough to fight us where we're strong. And so the only guys that are left are the ones that are at least smart enough to avoid our strengths, and by default they end up operating inside our gaps. It always provokes a food fight to suggest that we have succeeded our way out of a job and that our very success has created our own obsolescence. When you read literature on contemporary operational environment and you read the QDR, one of the things that we see emerging across the world are the rise of non-traditional non-military threats. If you think about China, for example, I personally am more worried about the threat of 1 million state-sponsored hackers who are practicing to attack our financial, capital, and information management systems, more than I'm worried about the conventional military threat that they pose. If you think about the consequences of 9/11 and the shock to the financial systems, imagine that multiplied 1 million times. And so we start seeing the consequences of failure in handling those non-traditional, non-military threats represent a significant risk to the nation's end state, if you will. Well, if it takes money to manage all those threats, it's fair to say what's in the nation's best interest? To spend more money. We're already spending half $1 trillion a year on Department of Defense. Is it better to continue to spend more money there to try to eliminate the gaps in conventional threats, or is it better to spend that money managing threats in the non-traditional, non-military threat? If you think that the non-traditional, non-military threats represent a greater risk than the threat of conventional war, it's then fair to say that instead of buying the most army that you can, you should buy the least in order to allow for flexibility in handling these emerging threats in a non-military, non-traditional way. Then it's fair to say, what is the minimum mission essential army that you need to buy in order to maintain dominance across the conventional threat, but not more than that, so that I have money available to handle these other emerging threats? How much insurance is enough becomes the question to ask, rather than what's the maximum amount of insurance that I can buy? What's the minimum amount that still meets the requirement? Committing to a 30-year solution provides the enemy a 30-year opportunity to pick his shot. And this gets after the idea that the response to the Cold War threat of the Soviet Union was to create a 30-year plan to outproduce them in terms of quality, quantity, and throw weight of our conventional heavy force. And we got into an economic warfare with them. And that type of a fight, a 30-year fight, can be reduced to rational analysis. And that's the kind of system that we have right now in PPB and E, and with a 7-year budget and long-term, 30-year scientific outlooks driving our acquisition strategies, and a very detailed, rigorous approach to solving that kind of analytical problem. But if you think that the nature of future threats is non-traditional, non-military, and that the enemy's morphing and finding our gaps, it's fair to ask, how sensible is it to try to make a change management system designed for one type of threat fit this new and emerging threat profile? At what point is it better to change the change management system than trying to amend it. Now, I'd like to consider the nature of evolutionary change versus revolutionary change, because after all, our change management system is designed to deal with change of all types. So what's the difference, and how do you know, and what are the different challenges based on the nature of the change? On the left-hand side, I want you to consider the green line to be a performance-cost trade-off that says, as I spend more money on the horizontal axis, I'm buying more and more capability, which improves my probability of decisive victory. And that there is, at some point, too little money spent gets me down in this area of unacceptable risk. Like I can't cut the force to 2 divisions because that's an unacceptable risk, clearly. And at the other end, I certainly can't afford 50 divisions. That's an unacceptable cost. I can't buy that much force. So somewhere in between that region of unacceptable risk and unacceptable cost lies a set of feasible solutions. And there are different cost and performance parameters all along that line. And the debate in the interested community really is centered on where do we draw the line for the consensus requirement? How do we collectively as an organization decide how much it is that we need? And what is it that we base that decision on? How much of it is driven by analysis? A lot of it. If you think of the Total Army Analysis, that's a 24/7, 2-year process designed to examine every possible range of threat scenarios, all the multivariable analysis, and figuring out what is the best and most affordable force to satisfy the full range of threats. But there are other things that go into that decision. Things like service cultures and politics and economics and diplomacy. There are an awful lot of things besides objective analysis that goes. There's an awful lot of art. And at the end of the day, it's probably more gut checks and politics that drive this decision rather than analysis. And so what I've arrayed here is something like a bell curve of consensus opinion, and that what emerges as a result of all of those different decision systems coming together is some agreement on where we're going to resource. And that's ultimately a political decision because Congress's job is to do that. And that will always be a political decision, informed by analysis and professional opinion, but it's a political decision at the bottom. Now, if you zoom in and take a look at that decision area where we've drawn the line, that's not a static performance curve. In fact, there are things happening all the time in an evolutionary sense that change those performance parameters. For example, if we were to find something like an unexpected price in a barrel of oil, that would drive up the costs of maintaining the fleet at a certain level of readiness and training. And so instead of that green line would move to the right as it costs more and more money to achieve the same level of readiness and effectiveness compared to our original forecast, which was the green line. Or we may have discovered in some program a better way to do business, and we have a technological fix that saves us money and adds capability, and so that green line moves to the left, where we start getting more capability for the same dollar. Theoretically, that's where our competitive advantage in the technological areas reside, that we can make things better, faster, cheaper, and improve our capabilities. So this green line is actually a dynamic line. It's changing all the time. That's the nature of the evolutionary change. But sometimes revolutionary changes occur. And it can occur in a couple different ways. In the first case you see down here, we could have a revolution in the enemy's threat capability. What you saw on the first chart was there was some distance between where we decided to resource our force and the region of unacceptable risk. And that distance between those 2 points can be thought of as our insurance premium. That's our insurance policy. When the enemy experiences a revolutionary change in his threat capability, now all of a sudden that line gets drawn differently. And now suddenly we're a lot closer to the edge than we thought. So revolutionary change in the threat's capability changes the dynamics of where that green line is and where the consensus requirement is going to end up changing. We can also see on the positive side a technology revolution. And let's think about the internet and the possibility for networked organizations across multiple levels, flattening the organization, a common operating picture that enables the warriors to multiply their capability through information. That's the promise of the internet. That's the promise of the future combat system and the warrior network. And that changes the dynamics of the cost and performance trade-off curve. So revolutionary change is such that the entire green line changes. And you go through a lot of volatility as people try to figure out, what is this change, revolutionary or evolutionary? How much does the green line change? And the philosophical debates become of great importance, particularly when they are informing a decision that's trying to get the main programs right for the next 30 years. Which leads me to wonder about the wisdom of committing to a 30-year solution that provides the enemy a 30-year opportunity to pick his shot. So let's say for a moment that you think that the most important component of the future combat system is the network that ties together the system of systems, which gives us the enduring advantage across multiple scenarios and multiple threat presentations. And it's that common operating picture that gives us our tactical advantage. It comes with a certain technological cost and certain technological risk. If we're going to commit to that solution for 30 years, we think that's where our competitive advantage comes from, and we trade off armor for information, then the enemy has a 30-year window in which, if he can disrupt that crucial component of future combat system, he can disrupt our warfighting concept for the next 30 years. Which leads me to wonder about the wisdom of a change management system that tries to get an answer that's suitable for the next 30 years. If you believe in the power of Moore's law that says computing power doubles every 18 months or less, what is the probability that the forecasts we're making today are going to be valid for 30 years out? Why does my answer have to be good enough to last 30 years? Can't I rely on our ability to sense, adapt, and respond to a changing environment faster than the enemy? And if you believe that, then what you should do is invest in sensors that allow you to detect changes in the environment, threat capability, and invest in rapid manufacturing capability that allows you to adapt and improvise as you detect a specific threat. The current system is designed to try to anticipate all threats and design over the next 30 years, and then design a system that will respond to all of those. So think about those two lines of inquiry. I want to shift gears just a little bit and start thinking about the M1, M2 versus future combat system decision in the same way that a family thinks about, should I buy, hold, or sell my used automobile? When should I buy a new one? When should I lease? When should I invest in repairs to the old one? And this chart simply sets up that dialogue. If you consider the conventional Cold War threat model, where our threat was committing to incremental improvements in their main combat systems on the conventional side, and each of those fleets had a certain life expectancy, we could analyze that and determine, let's say, what the enemy's capability curve looked like. And then our task was to ensure that we fielded fleets, here like the M60 and the M1, M2, that gave us a relative combat power advantage over the enemy. And so what mattered in that kind of a model was the relative capability difference between us and the threat, and not necessarily the absolute capability that we're buying. All along the way in the life cycle of M1 and M2, we found ways to make the business case to improve our capability by technological inserts, so improvements across the fleet, M1, M1A1, M1A2, and M1A2 SEP, all of which extend the life of the vehicle, add more capability to it, and preserves the capability advantage between us and the threat. There was a time when it made sense to retire the M60 fleet and then convert to the blue line representing M1, M2. As we started thinking about the total life cycle capability of M1 and M2, we recognized there was a need to develop the tank after next, if you will. Call that the future combat system, if you will. Stryker came along as an effort to bridge the gap between an aging M1, M2 fleet and an undefined so far future combat system, designed as a medium-weight, rapidly deployable combat platform that gave us a persistent competitive advantage against perhaps a declining conventional threat. In the future, we're going to be facing, and we're facing now, of course, recapitalization decisions that say, at what point does it make sense to invest money in refitting and resetting an M1, M2 fleet to give us additional years in the fleet that were not originally designed into the program, but which now might make economic sense to give us a capability that allows us to develop the FCS in the future. We'll run into the same challenges in the future with Stryker. These decisions are an awful lot closer now based on the number of op-tempo miles that we've added to the fleets based on OIF, OEF. The second part of this discussion, though, gets back to the idea of what happens to this sort of economic analysis when the threat morphs faster than the conventional threat did in the Cold War, basically the entire post-World War II period. If the enemy's capabilities don't lend themselves to graphing in such a 30-year manner, what do I have to do to my change management system and my leadership system that allows me to adapt to that more rapidly changing environment? Maybe the kinds of business decisions that we're comfortable making, that we're designed by nature to make, are no longer appropriate for the type of force that we need to field. I want to shift gears now and talk about why concepts matter, concepts like the future combat system. Well, one of the terms of art that you'll see in F100 is the idea of key performance parameters. Very important part of the initial phase of concept development and capabilities definition. Simple example. In the first iteration of future combat system, there was a key performance parameter specified that whatever platform was finally chosen had to conform to a 24-ton and C-130 transportable constraint. It's fair to ask why. And the reason to ask why is when you do the math, physics tells you that you cannot have an offensively capable system that also carries enough armor to protect you against direct fire and make it fit inside a C-130 and under 24 tons. You can't have all of that. So one of the things that you have to make a trade-off between is lightening it up, and you offset that less amount of armor with an increased amount of information, and the theory is that an improved common operating picture keeps you out of the positions where the enemy can hit you with direct fire, and so you're making a trade-off between armor and information that allows you to have survivability through information rather than armor. And it allows you to meet the performance parameters of 24 tons and C-130 transportable. It's fair to ask, though, why is this a trade-off that we have to make? Why is C-130? Why 24 tons? Can it be that we need those C-130 constraints for strategic deployments? I mean, our operational concept says that we're a force projection army, and we have to be able to reduce the amount of time to get from the CONUS base into the joint operational area. But if you think about that, you say, do we really use C-130s to make strategic movements? Am I really going to load FCSs into C-130s and CONUS and fly them to a JOA? I don't think so. It's a C-130s an intra-theater transport. Well, what about that constraint at the operational and tactical level? Do I need a C-130 capability to move future combat systems intra-theater to achieve success? Well, what does that look like? Consider the idea that I've got an enemy battalion over here, and what I need to do is move an FCS battalion an operationally significant distance into a position of advantage. Well, I can already drive 300 kilometers in a 24-hour period with combat power and all the sustainment that I need to achieve that position of advantage? How many times do I think I'm going to be in a position where that ground movement is not going to be possible, and that what I really need is the capability to fly that battalion into that position? If you think that that is a situation you're going to experience a lot, then you can argue that you need to have those key performance parameters inside the system definition at the start of research and development. But here's what happens, as we know in retrospect, just taking a look at OIF, that most of the time that we have spent in the red zone here in nation building and stability and reconstruction operations, and the nature of the threat there is that it's very hard to use strategic intelligence to identify concentrations of conventional force that represent threats to our conventional force. And now suddenly our information collection and dissemination system isn't protecting us against the things that are blowing up our softer skinned vehicles throughout the length of this phase of the campaign. In fact, the only place that you can really rely on the common operating picture and conventional and technical intelligence are in those high intensity portions of the campaign when the enemy's using conventional direct fire units against us. And so the trade-off that you can legitimately support in conventional operations between information and armor makes sense in between these two lines in the decisive phase. But as you start thinking about what's now phases 4, 5, and 6, the nature of the threat has changed. I'm not sure that you can really justify making the trade-off between information and armor. And in fact, all the programs to upgrade Humvee armor, to buy mine-resistant vehicles, all of those things are a response to the failure of conventional intelligence and intelligence sharing, information sharing, to respond in time against an unconventional threat and protect the force. I say all that simply to say that the initial definitions of capabilities that you make in the R&D phase have important consequences for the kinds of vehicles and platforms that you can field later on, and you have to consider the entire range of full spectrum operations when you're trying to define those capabilities. And in a capabilities-based acquisition system, getting those initial capabilities defined correctly and identifying the trade-offs that you can afford to make become a crucial component of success. Let's shift gears once more and consider the kinds of guidance that we receive from on high. When you read the QDR, it's fair to summarize the directives and implications for force management, force generation, the generating force, in the following way. You'll find this mind map really supports a discussion of the force management implications of the QDR. You might find this one to be very handy in F101. And so I won't belabor that point. Except to say, if you take up all the challenges and the directives that come out of the QDR, you might find yourself characterizing the problem as this. The blue dot represents the legacy force, if you will, the conventional Army's capabilities in terms of the range of individual skills that soldiers had to master, and leaders too, the types of echelons that we had to field with conventional battalions, brigades, divisions, and corps, and then the quality of the equipment and the capabilities of the equipment. So if you think about capability on three different axes, you might consider all of the guidance coming out of the QDR to expand our capabilities into the orange dot. In fact, the QDR tells us that our individual soldiers and leaders can no longer afford to be specialists. We have to be pentathletes. We have to be capable across the full spectrum of operations. And we have to be more capable in multiple echelons. The discussions of strategic corporals and nation builders and the three-block war all asks units today to do things in both directions, at the lower level and at the higher level, that in the more conventional Army we never had to do before. So the range of requirements for on the individual level, on the unit and the individual level, are going broader. At the same time, we're fielding a wider range of equipment, and so the technological challenges of mastering the potential of our new technology is great. At some point, it's fair to say how much of those directives, those assertions, those assumptions that we can do all those things is really hot air, which puts us at risk in reality when we try to have every soldier do everything and be all things to all people. At what point do we exceed the bounds of what's suitable, feasible, acceptable? When does our rhetoric put us at risk? It's fair to ask. Yeah, I hear all that, but at some point we still have to get it done. What do I do? The way we currently think about this is using a .mil-PF model. And basically, wherever you are, as you try to manage to the future force, whatever it may be, those elements of change typically find themselves in the .mil-PF solution areas. It's very useful for the majors that leave here to know who do you call when you have a solution that requires a doctrinal answer, or you have a requirement that needs a doctrinal solution, etc. And so this turns out to be a very nice check on learning and supports the takeaways very well from the strategic level lessons. And so this really just summarizes that whenever possible we try to get a solution that's in the doctrinal area, because that's the cheapest way to get the change done. Change the way you think. And then we will say maybe it's changing the mindsets of leaders. We'd like to solve things in that manner. Or if I can make a change in unit, leader, and individual training, maybe I can do that. Maybe by recruiting a different class of personnel or changing MOS structure, maybe there's a personnel solution, which is preferable to changing organizations, which is harder. And the final, most expensive, most difficult, and long-term and risky change is when we have to make materiel changes. And you can see in the C2 side who's involved and who's the lead with providing solutions based on the .mil-PF domain. Shifting gears, and you can think about this in the strategic lessons, F101 through F104. Well, what is the nation's strategy, the joint warfighting strategy? How do we manage uncertainty in the future by buying force? One way to think about that is to follow the money. What this chart shows is if you thought the threat to the nation is best answered by a balanced approach between Army, Navy, Air Force, and Homeland Defense, you might expect to see budget being equally allocated among the departments and services. If you thought we primarily had to guard against a land war, you might have big Army and balanced other services. If you thought it was primarily a sea-based threat or strategic shipping lanes, you might have big Navy, or you might say what we really need is big Air Force, or you might need big Homeland Defense. Depending on the nation's strategy mix, you would expect to see those policy decisions reflected in budgets. And when you actually take a look at the expenditure of money over time, what you see is that we really have adopted a balanced strategy throughout the years. This shows the service percentages of DoD budgets, and you can see pretty much a balanced approach to the nation's threats now. The one trend that is of note is that no matter what, the guy in charge is growing to be a bigger and bigger percentage of the DoD pie. He's retaining more and more money at the departmental level, and that follows a move to try to centralize and unparochialize the service approach to warfighting and bring it more and more under DoD direction. The only way you can practically do that in Washington is to retain budget authority. So I think that's a trend that you're likely to continue to see expanding in the future as DoD enforces its guidance and policy and directives by controlling the purse strings. This chart shows DoD budget percentage of the total federal budget and GDP, and this gets after the question, how much insurance are we really buying with the money that we spend? How much of our total income are we spending on national insurance? And so you can see here that we are pretty low as a percentage of GDP. Our GDP is so large that we still outspend the next 24 in a row. However, as a percentage of the total budget and total GDP, it's not unrealistic. So, having said all that, I will just come back to the roadmap to individual classes. And when we go through FDPs, you'll see some of these issues emerging in various different places. And so when we think about F-100 force management, I would ask you just to keep some of those other issues in mind and to know that those discussions, those dialogues are out there, and that you're likely to see some or all of those in your classroom with students. So there's more than simply describing how the Army is supposed to manage change inside our classrooms. We have 18 hours to make these discussions, and it should go beyond a simple description of the system as designed. So just briefly, you can see now the array of classes that we have. F-101, we talk about QDR and the National Security Strategy, and that mind map on the QDR is a handy way to kick that discussion off if you want. And that's where we examine what the national guidance and the national policy is and the force structure implications for us. As we try to generate a force, what kind of a force do we have to generate? What kind of mission set are we asked to support? F-102, JSIDs, and combat developments, we're taking a look at some of the nuts and bolts of who then converts that policy into structure. Where do the capabilities and the warfighting concepts come from? Who builds the increments of combat power that are going to satisfy those missions? In F-103, the new lesson this year, planning, programming, budgeting, and execution, and TAA gets after the resource. Once you've built the structures, how do you resource them? How do you get the mix right? In F-104 then, at the last of the strategic force management lessons, we talk about the future combat system. And it pulls together a lot of the conversation and discussions at the strategic level, and it's fair to ask, does the future combat system give us a 30-year solution to the full range of missions that we've been directed to provide? Do we have a way of managing our resources to respond to a changing environment and adjust the FCS program so that it can go in the directions we need based on threat changes? We then move into a couple of operational level lessons. F-105, FMS Web, then takes us inside the land of TO&E, so we can find individual unit capabilities and where they are in the readiness program and where they are in ARFORGEN in the documentation system. In F-106, we talk about contracting, and that's a balancing lesson. We will discuss a little bit about the philosophical implications and moral implications of increasing the amount of contractor support to the force, and we will also take a look at tie-ins to L-103, Leadership Ethics, Charlie 305, Operational Law Considerations, and then in interagency and multinational lessons that are taught by DeJamo, we will see that a lot of the support we provide to those processes take the form of contracting. So F-106 is a central lesson to our understanding of strategic and operational and even in tactical support. Very important lesson. In F-107 and 108, we get down into the tactical level. In F-107, the ARFORGEN lesson, we're going to see how a request for forces comes out of the geographical combatant commander's area, and the Army picks a brigade to satisfy that mission, and then we use ARFORGEN in order to get that unit fit to fight and deployed into that theater. And then in F-108, we examine how that unit, once deployed, can manage rapid change, how we use programs like Rapid Equipping Force and Rapid Fielding Initiative and the Operational Needs Statement and forward deployed AL&T teams to be able to improve the combat readiness and capability of units after they've already deployed into a theater. So you'll see throughout the F-100 series a set of strategic, operational, and tactical lessons that tie together the functions of the Army Change Management System from the generating force side and how that supports the operating force that we cover in the other lessons that you see noted in blue. Well, that's everything that I wanted to say. Hopefully you find some of this to be of interest. I am more than happy to give pieces of this in person in your lesson. If you'd like to hear this inside your classroom, you can work with me to get that done, and I'm delighted to discuss the implications or assertions that I've made throughout this presentation. Again, what I've tried to do is present F100 from the top down before we get into the trees. I want to give you the once over the forest from a practitioner's perspective, someone that's interested in this area, and to give you a sense of where the discussions go and how some of these larger questions affect the details of the lessons that we teach. So, thanks very much for your attention. Signing off.